Okay, so I'd like to welcome David Frayer, who's professor at the University of Kansas, and his talk will be about Krapina and the case for complex behavior in Neanderthals. David.
Well, like everyone else who's spoken, could you hear me okay? Yeah. Like everyone else who's spoken, I want to thank the Finlaysons for the invitation. It's great to come here and see some old friends that have gotten older and meet some people that I have never met before, but I wanted to. And then met some totally new people that I didn't expect. I also, coming from the middle of the continent in the U.S., I'm able to experience some foods here that we don't get fresh in Kansas, so I definitely appreciate that. My talk today is about Krapina, and these are my colleagues that have participated or contributed to the paper, especially Davorka Radovčić, and most of you know her. She's another Milford student, by the way. This place is dominated by Milford students. I'm the first one.
What number?
I'm number one. I don't know what she was. 72 or something. I don't know. 22. So this is the Krapina site, and picture taken, we think, around 1901. And it was a sandstone rock shelter that was being exploited a lot by people in town for the sand, and consequently, once some fossils were coming out, they notified Gorjanović Kramberger, and this is a picture of him dressed in the black suit there. He excavated the site along with his assistant Osterman between 1899 and 1905. People were talking about Dorothy Garrett and her rapidity of publication a couple of days ago. It took her 2 years to publish. Gorjanović published his monograph 1 year after the completion of the excavation. And it was a 200-page monograph with x-rays and all kinds of things in it. Published in German, so it wasn't accessible to lots of people. I just want to go back one thing. If you look at that picture, it doesn't look like it's very organized, that the excavations were done kind of haphazardly. But Gorjanović was, first of all, a fossil fish person, then a cartographer, and then a water specialist. So he was a scientist as opposed to, no offense, an archaeologist. Of course, there weren't many archaeologists in those days, but he approached the site in a way that the people who were excavating in other areas didn't. And the consequence of that was he dug in and labeled levels. He originally defined 9 levels and then collapsed the top 2 levels. So there, in the end, there were only 8 levels. Hominids are found, Neanderthals are only found there. They're found from the bottom to the top as are artifacts. The other thing that Gorjanović did was he wrote the level, he or Osterman or his other people that worked there, wrote the level on the specimen. Most of the hominid specimens, at least not the teeth, but the larger bones, have the specimen number written on it. So this is not the number, this is the level that it came from. And that's the hominid zone, which is level 4, level 5, where most of the humans were found. But again, I stress that he found humans, Neanderthals, all the way from top to bottom. He also labeled or wrote the level number on many of the tools and some of the animal bones. Oops. What happened? I know. Okay. We know that it was a short sequence. It's short in that it was probably less than 10,000 years. The sandstone, the cave doesn't exist anymore. Or it's not a cave. The shelter doesn't exist anymore. It's totally eroded away. But Gorjanović, being a person that was also interested in sedimentation, etc., predicted that it was a rapid accumulation of the sediments in the cave, and subsequently that Preston Miracle, another one of Wilford's students, at least he worked with him. Preston studied the male cave bears and found that the canines of male cave bears didn't change through time, and compared that to glacial sequences where the cave bears were the canines were much bigger. So he confirmed the rapid accumulation. We've known since 1996 that it's through ESR dating by Jack Rink and Henry Schwartz and others, that it's dated to 130,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years, which is MIS 5E. And the fauna seem to support this in the sense that they tend to be warm fauna. And the thing to point out here, and the examples that I'll use, is all done before this was accumulated well before any moderns were in the area. So the behaviors that are found here are exclusively Neanderthals. It's not like Grotto de Rem, where there's still going to be, I'm sure, some debate. I tend to agree with Francesco, but I'm sure there'll be debate about the artifacts. Well, at the site, as you know, through publications over the years, there are a lot of Neanderthals. Gorjanović argued that there were about 10 or more than 10, and Milford, looking at two sets in 1976 or something like that, argued that there were less than or equal to 82, probably, I think, somewhat less than that. But they're all Neanderthals. There's no doubt that from top to bottom, the mandibles that are found, the crania that are found, the A skull, Krapina 1 here for a time was considered to be a modern human, but subsequent modern analysis by Nancy Menu has shown that it's a Neanderthal child. There are also a lot of isolated teeth. This is what I spent most of my career working on. Over 200 isolated teeth, and I did it again. And there are a lot of postcranial remains of Neanderthals. So it's a rich site. I'm not going to talk about most of this, but and most of you know this anyway about the rich complex, the rich inventory at the site. But there's still a lot of work that can be done there. In 2007, after 10 years of compiling a bibliography of research and work on Krapina, I published this book through the Croatian Natural History Museum and ended up with 3,058 references between 1899 and 2005. And you would think that with more than 3,000 references, there wouldn't be much more to say about the site. I mean, what else could you say after more than 100 years of people looking at material? But there are new technologies that have come along that have opened new vistas about looking at internal bone structure. There are new ideas of just what's important to look at, and there are new eyes. And I particularly want to give credit to the new eyes of this woman, Davorka Radovčić. She's looking through the Krapina 3 skull. But she took over the curatorship from her father in 2013 after getting her PhD at Michigan, and did a total inventory of the site. She wanted to see what was there. So she looked at all of the human remains. She looked at all of the archaeological remains, tools and etc., and she looked at the fauna. And her new eyes looking at the site gave us some really unexpected, I have to say, unexpected results. I knew Seki when she was, I call her Seki, little sister, when she was like this big. Jakov and I picked her up at kindergarten, and while we went to the bar, she played in the alley. So it wasn't ageism and sexism so much, it was just astonishment that she came up with things that we had never seen before. But I want to focus on 4 elements of complex behavior at the Krapina Neandertal site, and I'll start with cannibalism. And you might think cannibalism really isn't complex behavior, but Gorjanović noted that there were cut marks on many of the animal and on the human remains, and hypothesized cannibalism in his 1906 monograph, and then published more on it in 1918. But he did this because he felt that the Krapina Neanderthals were, even though he called them a different species, he thought they were like humans, and that they were humans, and since humans practiced cannibalism, he felt this was a piece of evidence that made Neanderthals more like us as opposed to less like us. There are other people that studied evidence for cannibalism at the site, but probably the most important one was Herbert Ulrich from the university from Berlin, and Ulrich published cannibalism and body treatment among the Neanderthals at Krapina, and that was in I did put the date in 1978, and then in 2008, 2006, he published this paper in Periodicum Biologium on mortuary behavior at Krapina, and he shifted a lot of his thinking about cannibalism at the site to more focusing on body preparation. And Ulrich had a lot of line drawings of the way Neanderthals treated postcranial elements, for example. And here you can see a bunch of humeri that show cut marks on them and damage to the joint areas. But he argued that this was more in relation to not just eating the flesh from the Neanderthals, but for body preparation for mortuary practices. As you can see, I don't need to read the quote, but I can tell you that he said that cut marks are more of an indication of body preparation and removing of flesh than they are of cutting off meat for human consumption. So Herbert changed a lot in his thinking over that 10-year period and moved away from cannibalism and talked a lot more about secondary burials and defleshing and body treatment. Well, part of the reason he did this, I think, was related to another student of Milford's. God, it's like Milford week here. Mary Russell, who actually applied to Kansas, and I said, don't come to me, go to Michigan. It's much better there. And Barry looked at the postcranial remains from Krapina, and only the postcranial remains from Krapina, and she argued, and she compared them to a site in Michigan called the Juntinen site, which was a proto-historic site where they were known to practice secondary burials. They lie the body out and let the flesh deteriorate, cut the remaining flesh off, bundle the bones together, and then bury the individuals. And she compared that to Combe-Grodal, where she looked at cut marks on animal remains, a reindeer. This is a picture of clavicles, and the dark lines from Mary's work. The dark lines on here show cut marks at Krapina, and the lighter lines show cut marks at Juttenden. And she argued that the position and the number of the cut marks that were found on the clavicles and the position and the number that were found on the humeri and femurs, and she also looked at the radius and the ulna and the tibia, were consistent with the pattern of butchery that was found at the secondary burial site, Juttenden, as opposed to the reindeer butchering for meat at Combe Grenal. And I circled the important categories here, but she found 128 bones at Krapina with 48 cut marks on them. At Juttenden, which is about 37% or something, she found about 33% at Juttenden, a lot more bones, but the same percentage of cut marks. And then she found very few cut marks for reindeer butchery at Combe Grenal, and then did chi-square tests and showed that Krapina was like Juttenden and unlike Combe Grenal, and Juttenden was also unlike Combe Grenal. Well, this is the conclusion of Mary's research, and she attempted to show that the frequency of cut marks and the number of cut marks and the location of the cut marks were more likely related to meat removal for secondary burial as opposed to consumption. There are some problems that have arisen, at least in my mind and the minds of others, about this research. One is that there are very few articulated bones at Krapina, so you don't find any evidence that they were bundled together. Maybe it was because there was a lot of cave bear activity in the site and everything got mixed up, but on the other hand, you'd expect to find a few. There are some hand remains that seem to be associated, but it's difficult to find any bones that articulate. It also, her work was limited to the postcrania, and the question is why there's so many isolated teeth at the site. Where do they all come from, and how do they fit into this reburial picture? The most devastating criticism came from Palavia, who said the research was absurd, which I thought was kind of harsh. But she, as you know, worked at a Neolithic cannibalism site in southern France and argued that the patterns there were totally different than what Mary had shown. That the patterns there were similar to the patterns at Krapina, and it was probably cannibalism at Krapina. I think the point is that we don't really know. The bones were not carried onto the site by animals because there's very little, I think there are just a couple of bones that show any kind of tooth marks from animals. And the Neanderthals must have carried them onto the site and disposed of them somehow. We don't really know, but it seems to me that it's more likely a ritual as opposed to cannibalism for meat. So secondary burials, cannibalism, who knows for sure, but I think it probably indicates at least some level of complex behavior. The final thing I'll say about this, almost, is that a paper appeared in Scientific Reports in 2016, and James Cole argued that cannibalism is not a very effective way of obtaining meat because of the amount of meat that you can get. It's a lot easier to hunt a deer as opposed to a human. This is similar to what Stanley Garn said, another Michigan person, a long time ago. So the cut marks that seem to indicate some kind of ritual behavior as opposed to survival cannibalism. And I'll remind you, there are a lot of large mammals at Krapina, and there probably were a lot more that Gorjanović didn't collect, but there's a lot of rhinos, there's a lot of with cut marks on them. There are all kinds of other large ungulates that are at the site, so that they weren't wanting for food. And I was thinking last night, I didn't put the slide in, but any signs of starvation, etc. There's one specimen from the site that has multiple teeth with enamel hypoplasia, but for the most part, the teeth are completely well-formed without any indication of any kind of growth interruption that would be associated with starvation. So, and the final thought here is that the cannibalism there, the human bone assemblage, their difference from Ulagersi, where there really was cannibalism, where there are a lot of split bones. I think there's only one split long bone. They're broken off, but split longitudinally at Krapina, and there are very few compression factors, maybe none. So the treatment of the dead there seems to be more involved with some kind of ritual behavior than it does with just eating the flesh. Now on to one that's a little more convincing, I suppose. That's the Krapina 3 skull. It used to be called Krapina C. This is a specimen. I'll go back. Milford put that piece of frontal on in 1976. It was not attached before. And he didn't just describe, he said he noticed, but he didn't describe, noticed that there were etched parallel lines that run up the frontal. Unfortunately, the specimen, both the frontal fragment and the rest of the cranium, are heavily coated with lacquer, so it's impossible to do any kind of cut mark analysis that you see on in other studies. The other thing I'll point out is that there's only one other cut mark. I haven't shown you the other cut marks yet, but there are a bunch of them. There's only one other cut mark on the skull, and it's on the temporal. This is what the cut marks look like. There's a series of parallel lines that run up the frontal and are pretty much separate from each other. There's no sign of healing on any of these, so that was something that was done after the death of the individual. They're filled with cave sediment, in some cases preservative. I'll show you another picture, a close-up in a second of that. And they're not recent, because you can see that recent breaks on the back of the back of the frontal or in the middle are white as opposed to these marks. So here's a close-up. We used a stereoscopic camera to do the analysis here, and that's where this picture comes from. But you can see the parallel nature of the lines. You can also see the cave sediment that's filling the lines, so that they're old as opposed to young. The red line shows the mid-sagittal plane, and we numbered the lines from 1 to 35. So, as I said, they're mostly parallel. There are a couple of, and surely there were more, because you can see that there's this gap here that relates to a break that occurred a long time ago. Not something that happened when somebody dropped the skull or something. There are two lines that cross over. I don't know if you can see them. There's a line right here. You can see that crosses over, and there's another one over there, and then there's one that we call an intersection. But for the most part, the lines are very separate from each other. Here are the lengths. Here are the lengths. And I think you can see that they differ from I showed the slide before, from cannibalism, where the temporal muscle is removed on the left, or burial preparation, I should say. And this close-up is of the inside of one of the mandibles that show the removal of the tongue. These differ from cannibalism, secondary burial marks. They're not associated with muscle removal. There isn't any. You can see there's really not much muscle there to eat. They differ from scalping. I don't know that there's a lot of evidence for scalping in Europe, but in North America, Native Americans scalped Europeans, but they did it like this, from the sides, as opposed to coming down the middle. And they're not recent. They're not related to cleaning. They're not related to trampling. They're not related to muscle, to measurement markings. So what's left? Well, we think that some kind of a ritual occurred where the frontal was scored at one time, whether it was scored when it was attached to the Krapina 3 cranium, or whether it was maybe as a separate bone where the scoring took place. And you could make up stories about what the scoring was, because Krapina 3 is a female, that maybe it was, who knows, the number of, I'm not going to make up any stories about it, but we just think that it had some kind of purpose and some kind of meaning other than just being random. Now, this is where Davorka's sharp eye comes into view. And some of you know about these because I know that she presented these talons a few years ago. But she found 8 talons and a phalanx with cut marks and other evidences of manipulation on them. They come from the very top layer at the site. We know that because there's a 9 on one of the talons. So it came from level 9 before he relabeled at level 8. And we also know that Gorjanović misidentified the eagle remains as the golden eagle. But Croatia then was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and there was a bird expert in Hungary named Kalman Lambrecht. And Kalman, or Lambrecht, or whatever, published in 1915 a description of the talons, and he identified the talons as the white-tailed eagle. This is a plate that's Kalman there, and this is a plate from his publication. He didn't publish one of the talons. He picked one of the talons, we're not sure why, except it was the one that was covered with matrix. But the picture is really revealing in many ways about, it tells us about the morphological details of the talon that they're old. This is a reconstruction of the white-tailed eagle. We have, as I said, 8 talons and a phalanx. We know that they came from multiple eagles. Davorka and another colleague have done research on this in Vienna. There are at least 3, maybe 4. The 4th one we're not sure of because it's the one that's covered with matrix, right talon 2. This, again, is the Lambrecht 1915 publication, and what's interesting about this publication is that you can see where the arrow is. You can see that there are cut marks on the face of the talon, on the proximal end of the talon. You can also see a polished area on the talon that is maybe better shown in this diagram. You can see that there are 3 cut marks that run across the proximal end of the talon, and you can see the we called it an ebrinated area, but a highly polished area that's up on the top. If we go back to Coleman again, he depicted this specimen, and you can also see that there's a polished area there. And here's this is a right talon, a left talon 3, and you can see the polished area. You can also see some cut marks above it, and then these are not covered with lacquer, so we can do an SEM, and this is an SEM showing the polished area. And there are the cut marks. There is also this phalanx that shows, I think there are 18 or 21 cut marks on the specimen. They're all on the dorsal or the lateral side, nothing on the bottom. And they're maybe related to defleshing, but there seems like there are a lot of them. Here's a picture of the specimen from the top and from the side, and you can see these large cut marks that are on the area. And then notice the black arrow that's there that shows that polished area, which is not matched by a polished area on the phalanx. So we're not really sure if these two go together, but it's a nice picture showing all the cut marks on the phalanx. We think that these were strung together as a necklace or as a bracelet or maybe as a rattle. This came to us a few months ago, that it might have been a rattle. And the reason for that is these abrasions that you see, but we also see the cut marks that are not really sharp. They seem to be eroded, they're smooth, and we also find eburnation, or these highly polished areas on the cut marks. So they must have been rubbing against each other, just like an arthritic knee would rub, the femur, distal femur would rub against the tibia to produce eburnation. And those of you skeletal biologists I know have seen that. We also find polish, and all of the talons show polish on the medial and the lateral sides. So they must have been hitting together, and Francesco did a paper a number of years ago with some people on shells, where they showed that shells must have been in a necklace because they showed this kind of, a similar kind of polish or alteration. We also find on 3 of the talons nicks that are taken off of the ventral surface, and here you can see that nick that's there. So there's been a lot of manipulation in these talons, and there's every reason to think that they are all found together, probably as a necklace, as a rattle, or whatever the Neanderthals were doing with them, but they were found as a collection. And this is just a little summary showing the amount of manipulation that occurs on the talons. Now, some of you already know everything that I've said about these talons because we published it already. And I thought you'd like to know that, get some information that hasn't been published, and that involves a fiber that we've located under silicate. Originally thought it was carbonate, but the chemist, the physicists, chemists tell us that it's a silicate. As you can see, it's kind of a U-shaped fiber. It's twisted. I'll show you an even closer view of it in a second. But it's covered by silicate. It's not the only fiber that's on this specimen. Here's another one that's off to the side a little bit, but we haven't analyzed this one, so I can't really talk about it. And we're sure that we just haven't been able to do the work yet, but we're sure that there seems to be very likely there are other fibers on the Krapina specimens. Now the question is, how do you analyze this fiber? Here's an arrow to show you, just in case you didn't see where it was. It's in a cut marks. How do you analyze the fiber without destroying it? This is where my level of competency starts to really fall off the table, because this is where they did, Seki did, Davorka did, synchrotron data in Trieste. So there's the fiber again at higher magnification, and you can see the twists that are in it, and you can see that the silicate is of various thickness because it's a little more apparent, dark green color. Black, green color is more apparent in some areas than in others. So Davorka contacted the people in Trieste at the synchrotron, and we were determined. She's the curator more than me, but she was determined to find techniques that would be non-destructive, because you can't destroy something like that. And eventually, after trying Raman analysis, which I'd never heard of before, but it didn't work because of the thickness, we contacted Giovanni Berarda and Lisa Vicari. That the next few slides come directly from them. I've never met them. I took chemistry and physics when I was in high school 54 years ago. And even if I had been paying attention, I would have forgotten it by now. Plus, it wasn't very relevant, and I never took biochemistry. So, I mean, like I say, I have the reports. So, if anybody wants to read the reports, you can see them. This is what they did, and this is the first slide of their analysis, and one of the most important, I think. And they did focal plane array analysis. They did it along that white line of the fiber. The green-red blob in there looks like a storm front or something, but that is an indication of the amount of absorbance of the, as I understand it, of the infrared. What's important about this is that they identified the fiber as collagen. They found collagen there and not cellulose, so that this is not hemp or plant material. This is some kind of animal material. Unfortunately, they couldn't go beyond that, but they were convinced that the fiber is of animal origin. We don't know what kind of animal. This is more analysis that they did, and again, I can't really explain. It's a little bit embarrassing, but I can't really explain what all this means, except that they did scanning to further confirm that it's a collagen-based fiber as opposed to plant. The other thing which is more important, maybe at least additional importance, is that they analyzed the character of the fiber, and they found that, again, this doesn't mean much to me. Maybe it means a lot to somebody else, but that the fiber is old. Okay, I mean, just reduce it down to that. They say the fiber is old. It's not something that was placed there. It's not covered in lacquer. Okay, it's only covered in this silicate. And their conclusion is that the fiber is a remnant of leather or sinew. It could have been a ligament from the eagle. We're not really sure. If anyone has any ideas of how to further analyze this without destroying it, I'd be happy to hear it and pass it on to Davorka. The other thing that I just mentioned, and based again on their analysis, our observations initially and then their analysis, is that we found pigment. We found a few small dots of red that are on the fiber, and lots of dots and large areas of black. And the question we had is, what is this? Is it something like the Krapina 3 skull that has that red limonite on it, or is it actual red ochre? And there's more of that black. I'll come back to the black stains in a minute. Most of the black stains are in the proximal area of the talon. They're not on the distal ends. Here's a close-up of the red spot and the sampling that they took along that. And this is the graph that they produced. Again, I apologize. I'm ignorant about what this means, except they say that it's ochre. That this graph showing the absorption rate tells us that it's ochre as opposed to any other kind of red, like the limonite, for example. They also analyzed the black spots, and again, it's a nice picture. And the conclusion that they drew from the distribution of the reflectance is that it's manganese. But they can't tell if it's manganese that is, and by the way, the reason that the red line is higher than the blue line, I do know this, is that the red line is a more concentrated area of the black or the manganese, whereas the blue is off more to the side. So it's just a difference in concentration. Manganese is attracted at sites to organic materials, so this could be completely natural. We're not really sure, but there's a lot of these black stains that are on the talons, and the human remains don't show any of the black stains. As far as I know, there's no. We haven't looked, but presumably there's no ochre on any of the Neanderthal remains. So besides collecting these talons, they were using red ochre or some kind of pigment, maybe not applied directly to the talon, but applied to leather or whatever was holding the talons together, and maybe manganese as pigments. This is not the first time that manganese or red ochre has been found associated with Neanderthals or even earlier sites, but it's nice to find it at Krapina. And we plan to do more work. These spots of the red ochre are not big, so it takes a lot of scanning and a lot of work to find them, and then you have to take them to Trieste, and it'll take a while to get the full analysis done. And it takes a lot of money, too. Now, the final example that I want to use for complex behavior is a rock, and also Davorka also found this rock when she was going through the archaeological collections. Jan Šimik, the archaeologist from Tennessee, Fred Smith, another one of Milford's students, was also involved in this, but Fred really didn't have anything to do with the stone tools. Šimik did an analysis of the stone tools. There are 1,191 artifacts that are found there. 273 are stone tools, and many of them have the level marked on them. They come from top to bottom at the site. And then there are 918 unmodified flakes and cores. These are the unmodified, this is just a pile that I made back in January when I was there showing the stone tools. Šimik identified them as being as typical Mousterian, and Šimik's analysis was just on the taxonomy of the material as opposed to any kind of analysis like edgeware or whatever. So there's a big collection there that you have students, I suppose. There's a big collection there that needs to be studied. Šimik, following earlier work, noted that the majority of the material are tufts and chert. Nothing very extravagant, although there's a bunch of unknown stuff, as you can see, unknown tools down at the bottom. they called these exotics. These exotics couldn't have been collected, or any of the tools would collected from the cave wall because it was a sandstone cave, so they weren't, everything had to be brought in, and then everything had to be collected by Gorjanović and then taken back to Zagreb, or taken back to Zagreb. But here are a few of the exotics that I just laid out and took a photograph of. Again, I'm not an archaeologist, so maybe some of you don't think they're exotic. But this is the 144-305 rock that I'll just end up with. It's about this big. You can see the scale, but it's about this big. It's easily held in the hand. It's a microtic limestone, so it's a mudstone, but it's very hard. It doesn't show any signs of cortex on it. There are arrays of dendrites that are all over the face of the specimen, plus there's this long, dark stain across the bottom, as you can see, it then runs up the side. But it's a really interesting rock. In fact, our paper that we published on this was called An Interesting Rock from Krapina. It's not from the site, as I said, because none of the stone tools can come from the site. And a few years ago, we surveyed outcroppings that were around the Krapina site, and we found a few microtic limestone outcroppings, but nothing that looked as exotic as that. But there's no reason to think this came from like over the Alps or something. Has anyone ever seen anything like this at their sites? What's interesting about this is that Šimić, who's a really competent archaeologist, they put a number on it, as you can see, 144-305, but there was never any discussion or depiction of it in the article in the Journal of Human Evolution. This is the other side. There's a recently broken flake, and we can tell that because it has a lighter gray color. We didn't, after we published the paper, some got like the one about the Gorham's Cave thing, sent me an email saying it looked like a buffalo or something, so you say. But I don't want to make any observations about the shape of it, other than the fact that that this side also has this complex of dendrites on it. A few years ago, Davorka presented some of this at the Vienna Natural History Museum, and a woman that was there that studies microbes or small animals, and she argued that this is not plants, but burrows of small animals through mud. The other thing you can see from, it doesn't really matter what produced them, it's the fact that they're there. You can see that there's no black stain on this side, it's only on the other side. The geologists that we worked with wanted to section the rock, but we said, no, we can't section the rock to see more details. The other thing about the rock that's interesting is that it's, when you wet it, when it's wet, it's much more distinctive. So they really, the dendrites really stand out. Here's a just close microscopic view of what the dendrites look like. And it kind of looks like a plant there, but again, I don't really care. One of the questions that I had a few days ago was, where are the kids? And the reason I said that was that I was at a conference at the Neanderthal Art Conference in Torino a few weeks ago, and Michelle Langley was there, and she talked about the importance of kids, and the kids are ignored in as potential contributors to archaeological assemblages, whether they're practicing or whether they're picking up tools and bringing them in. And so I don't know who collected this, but maybe it was collected by a kid. I don't know that we'll ever know, but it's interesting. I always assumed there was just a male that collected it, but maybe it was a female too. You know, they were around too. What levels it come from, we're not really sure because there's no level mark on this one, but there is some of this limonite staining that's on this edge, and here's a close-up of that with some of the dendrites. You can see the dendrites are full of black sediment. It's not manganese, it's some other black sediment. I'm not sure what it is. A few other specimens for Krapina have this limonite staining, and for example, Krapina 3, that shows it. I've already talked about that, but this is from level 4, the Homo zone, so maybe it came from there. Preston Miracle talked about limonite staining on a beaver ischium from level 1, and here's the specimen from level 1, and the arrow points to cut marks. So this is something that was not there naturally, but the Neanderthals were cutting up for food. So to summarize this and to end the paper of the presentation, the margins of the rock have not been retouched, so it was never a tool. There's no use wear on any of the edges. The rock is from off-site, so it had to be carried to the site. And it seems to have been collected by a Neanderthal just because it was an interesting rock. Maybe a curio. There are curios at other Neanderthal sites. There's a geode that's found much later in time with red ochre on it, and here's a couple of Acheulean hand axes that are found in England that are much earlier in time, but I do it not so much for these, but for Oakley's description also at the site of some coral-bearing chert that was collected from 193 kilometers away from Swanscombe. So it had to be carried, it's a long way, it had to be carried to the site and left there. Jill Cook, a colleague, told me that it reminded her of a field of flowers with this, these coral exposures. And the people from the area where the stones come from call them starry stones, and they say they bring to mind the night sky. We don't know if that's what the Neanderthal was thinking about, who carried it. We don't know who carried it on and what they were thinking about, but it clearly was an interesting rock for them. And here's a close-up of one of the stars exploding. And whatever the explanation for this, is an interesting rock, and one that I would have collected as an adult, as a kid, or an adult. So, complex behavior at Krapina. Disposal of the dead. Probably not cannibalism. Probably secondary burials. I don't know that we'll ever know. Clearly, there's ritual manipulation of that frontal of Krapina 3. What it means, we're not sure of, but there's some kind of manipulation there. The eagle talons, the bird people like the eagle talons and the phalanx and the fibers and the colorants suggest that there was some kind of personal ornamentation at the site, which we don't often associate with Neanderthals, at least not in the past, but we do now. And finally, there's the interesting rock. And all this is done without the help of moderns. The Neanderthals weren't looking over the bushes to see what the moderns were doing, but they were doing it on their own at 130,000 years ago. Does it indicate complex behavior? I think it does. In any other context, it would. I mean, you find eagle talons associated with Native Americans, you would say this is associated with some kind of ritual complex behavior. But it's always hard to make the case for Neanderthals because it's what things that people have talked about here is because of the bias. So, you decide.